Okay, this is the structural and mechanical model, and I've got the containment tree open here. What I've highlighted is the Excel spreadsheet, which is the data input-output form for this model, and it's highlighted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open that file, and so Excel opens. I'm going to drag over the Excel model and go to the input page, where you can see that this is the values that would be facing the payload provider or the launch vehicle provider. The verification requirement paragraph numbers are listed in the first column. The short name or the criterion for each of the requirements are listed there, keeping in mind that this is data input based on this interface specification. So if it's a value here that's Boolean, um, there's a drop-down menu that they can pick, true or false. Um, and you can also see that there's a pop-up menu that actually cites the language in the specification. So some of these are clearly the contractor believes that their system meets the requirement or does not meet the requirement. Um, if it's numerical, there's also a drop-down menu, but for example, section 3.1.1.4, there has several lines related to encroachment of the payload hardware on the payload fairing. And so they've got to put in some values, which are numerical, real numbers. And so these are inputs that allow the person to put that data in. So once this table is populated, what it does is I'll go over, there's a tab down here, an input tab for each of these sections. So for example, if I go down here to 3.1.1.4, all those values, you can see there's a formula up here that references the cell. So for example, payload dynamic deflection references cell D15 on the input tab or the sheet, and so D15 is right here, payload dynamic deflection. So that's the input table. But what I've also done is there's an output tab for each of these as well, and that's what's synced up to the Cameo model. So in the output tab, I've also I've copied the input tab data. And the reason that I've done two different tabs is that Cameo is going to write the results. See, the results are blank; they're highlighted in amber. So Cameo is going to calculate the payload fairing to payload clearance. And once that's done, it's got to be less than or equal to 1 inch. And if that is met, then the clearance result is going to give you a Boolean true or false. But Cameo is going to do those calculations and write these values back to the output tab, not the input tab. And there's a reason for that. It's going to overwrite all the formulas that are in here, so we have to do something else. So right now, the outputs are showing 0. So now what I'm going to do is close this file, and I'm not going to save it. And I'm going to go back to, and I have this instance table open, 3.1.1.4, which matches the tab that you just saw. So since I've synchronized this Excel file to this model, I'm going to read from the file, and it's actually going to go pull the data from the output tab, which right now is the same as the input tab. So you can see that here's the input data, but in the payload fairing to payload clearance cell, it's still 0 because the calculation hasn't been done yet, and it defaults to false for the Boolean result because we haven't yet run the calculation. So now that I've got an instance in my instance table pulled in from the Excel file, I can go up here to our drop-down menu where I've already built the simulation configurations to run the Cameo simulation toolkit. So I'll highlight minimum clearance requirements, hit the arrow to do run. It opens up the parametric diagram that's got all the value properties and the constraint arguments to make this calculation, because we're calculating this value here, the clearance in inches, which then is going to be compared on that inequality to see if it meets the result. So let's go back to the instance table, and you can see now this value is filled in. It's 1.455 inches, and so the clearance has got to be greater than or equal to 1 inch, so that means it's true. So now what we have to do is read this value back, or rather write it back to the file. So I've hit this value, and you can see that the data was written to that file. So let's go open it up. And we'll go to 3.1.1.4, and you can see that here the instance data is written. There's the value there. There's the value here. True. But notice if we go to the output, we still have all zeros here. And that's why I had to build a macro into this, because it overwrites. Notice how on the other output files that haven't been overwritten yet, you can see that there's still the cell formula in there. But on this one, when Cameo dumped the data into this Excel spreadsheet, it got rid of all the formulas that were in there, and it's just the data. And the same, so that for whatever reason in the output table, we have to do a macro. So what I've done is I have recorded a macro in this workbook. So now that workbook is open, and I'm just going to make sure that the macro is assigned to that button. So now the macro is assigned to that button. So if I hit record calculations, you can see now that on 3.1.1.4, payload hardware clearance compliant is true. And I've only done it for this one section, but I have the actual macro runs through this whole list. So if all of these output values were populated with data, then I could come out here to this roll-up table, hit the record calculations macro, and it would populate all of these things here. So that's basically how the data goes in and out. And what you would want to do is take this output table and then go down here and hit move or copy, create a copy, put it in a new book, and save it, and then go back to the data input output form and close it, and don't save it. That's because we still want this form to be open in the output section to dump the data into. And also the reason that I have to have the macro outside is because Cameo will not allow you to attach a macro enabled Excel file, only just a standard one. So that's how the data works. It's a workflow, and one of the things that I'm trying to work on is to find a way to run all the calculations sequentially, all of these simulations, whether that be through a macro with inside Cameo or some sort of an executable activity diagram. That has yet to be determined, but something that would speed up and automate the simulation of all of those parametric calculations.